Hello there, welcome back to Jennie Designs with Paper and this week's episode of Crime and Coloring, where we take an alphabetical journey through the United States and revisit some of the earlier crimes. But before we talk crime, let's talk coloring. I purchased this month's Hero Arts kit, including a couple of extra things that were released this month. So before I start coloring, I'm going to walk you through the contents of the card kit. I will be using the critter stamp and dies that are included in this kit. I'm going to end up making 2 cards because I could not get all of the critters on one card. I'm using alcohol markers, my Copic markers, so I stamp them in a Copic friendly ink. I did use a little bit of white gouache to add some splattering to one card, but I forgot to zoom out so you couldn't see it, so I edited that out. But yeah, so that's all about the coloring. So let's go ahead and jump into our crime. Last week we left off in Craig, Alaska in the fall of 1982. Mark and Irene Colthurst had traveled on their $750,000 fishing vessel and docked in Craig, Alaska's harbor to offload a catch of salmon, and were preparing to, Irene and the kids were going to fly home because their 5-year-old daughter, Kimberly, was about to start school. And Mark was going to go for one more catch and then head home to Bellingham, Washington. Unfortunately, their fishing vessel was set afire to cover up the deaths of all 8 people on board. Mark, Irene, their 5-year-old daughter, their 4-year-old son, and the 4 crewmen on board of the ship were all discovered murdered, and the ship was set on fire to cover up the fact that they had in fact been murdered. They were able, through autopsy and other forms of investigation, to identify the remains of 7 of the 8 people on ship. They never found the remains of little John, the 4-year-old, and it was determined that he must have been right at the center of the fire because they could not find anything from him. Through that fall, so this was September of 1982, and through that fall there was lots of investigation, obviously, lots of speculation, lots of theory. But by November of 1982, the murders and the arson were no longer the main thing in the news. They were no longer the most urgent investigation, and this was kind of bumped to second place. And we talked about last week how fishermen in that area had actually collected a reward of $15,000 because they wanted this crime solved. There was a worry that the person who committed that crime, was actually working on the fishing ships still. By that fall, the police had released a sketch of a specific young man. Now, this young man was seen in the skiff that belonged to the investor. That was the name of Mark's ship, and he was seen by the crew of another ship, the Casino. He was seen by the town people, and he was seen pumping gas and storing it in this, or hauling it in this skiff that belonged on the Intrepid. Now, the description of this young man varied. Some people said he was middle-aged as opposed to young. Some people said he was more native Alaskan than white. But eventually the sketch released by the police described him as a white male with a slight build, 5'9" to 6 feet tall, longish, unkempt, blonde or light brown hair, with a pockmarked or scarred face, wearing glasses with rectangle lenses. Later, when reporters asked people in town if they could identify the man in the sketch, one resident was quoting as saying that he was so completely unremarkable that there were 500 people in town who resembled or who fit that description. So the fall of 1982 rolls around, and then 1983 rolls around, and in the spring of 1984, with a lot of the fishing crew returning to Alaska, the investigation kind of picked up a little bit of speed. And then by that summer of 1984, the state troopers actually said that they had narrowed their list of persons of interest down to 3 people. and then eventually just to one person. Now, this one person was linked to the crime through a web of rather circumstantial evidence and the inability to remove him from the suspect list through personal vetting. So it wasn't that anybody could definitively say he had committed this crime. It was more that nobody could definitively say that he didn't commit the crime and that he wasn't in the area at the time. Several friends and family members of this suspect were floored. There's no way that could be him. In fact, many people of the Colthurst family, Mark's family, they knew him and they described him as a really pleasant guy. So how did this guy become the one main suspect over the course of 2 years? Well, on September 10th of 1984, just after the second anniversary of the murders and the fire, the police announced the name of their main suspect, John Kenneth Peel. He had been taken into custody at just after 7 that morning and was in jail in Ketchikan, Alaska. And I probably butchered that name, I'm sorry. The authorities there were charging him with all 8 murders. His bail was set at $1 million. And the only question left in the minds of the investigators is where this trial is going to take place. In Alaska, where the murder and arson occurred, or in Washington, where the victims and the suspect had lived. John Peel was also a Bellingham resident. Bellingham, Washington, if you remember, is where Mark and Irene and their families. Mark and Irene were born there. They lived there. They grew up there. And so, apparently, had John. Now, the evidence against John was circumstantial. John was known to and known by the Colthurst family and the crew on the Investor. In fact, John had at one time been a crew member for Mark during the 1980 and 1981 fishing season, but was intentionally not hired to work on the Investor, Mark's new fishing ship. Multiple people said that the relationship between Mark and John had soured, but it was believed that John had been able to get a job on another ship in 1982, which was also working out of the Alaska seas. John was actually seen by people in the town of Craig interacting with Mark and Irene's family. If you remember last week, we talked about how after they offloaded their fish, they spent the night in town and they went to eat at a restaurant and celebrated John's birthday. Well, people in town saw John and Mark and their family at the restaurant where the family was last seen and the crew was last seen. So that's a little bit, okay, that's a little bit, everybody in Craig saw them, I guess. It was only a town of like 1,300 people, but the police were heavily relying on the fact that John and Mark and his family and his crew were seen on the last night that the family was alive. However, in the 2 years since the murders and the arson, John had gotten married. He and his wife had had a child. He'd actually stopped fishing and had gotten a job building ships in Bellingham to support his family. And it was a job that did not require him to leave his new family or his young family for months on end. John did not really have a criminal history. He wasn't linked to drugs. He wasn't linked to robberies. There was no history of violence. But somehow he became the prime suspect in this murder spree and arson. And what's even funnier is that originally the police had dismissed him as a suspect. His name had come up in the original investigation because of the reported falling out he had with Mark. But now the police are saying, no, this is him. It's this guy. Multiple witnesses, the police said multiple witnesses, and I guess that means more than 2, had called the information tip line that had been set up by the state police and told them to look into John. They had told the police that they were convinced that John was involved, and so the police kept investigating. They figured all they needed was a motive. I mean, they kind of had one because John was not rehired by Mark. But they needed to find enough evidence to rule him in or rule him out. So they began to investigate him again. They, in fact, administered a lie detector test, and John supposedly failed, which that's not admissible. And if he was nervous for any reason, he would have failed that test. But it is a little suspect. But still, after that failed polygraph, the police did not think it was him. And then, as time goes on, boom, he's one of the three, and then boom, he is the one. And not only is he the one who's arrested, his bail is huge, $1 million. So John was actually held on a bond, and his trial was set to begin in January of 1986. That is like 2.5 years later. The state was going after him for murder and arson, and the arson alone would get him a 20-year sentence. The murders of those 8 people would get him a 99-year sentence. The police stated that their investigation was 3-pronged, and John admittedly fit the description of the man described by the witnesses on the Trawler Casino, the first boat to go help in the fire. He fit the description of the man who had purchased some gasoline in the skiff that belonged to the investor. And he looked like the man who drove the investor's skiff to the city dock and supposedly went to help when the investor was on fire. Words are hard. But some of these witnesses, when shown an actual photograph of John, didn't name him as the guy in the sketch, like, yeah, no, that's not him. Or they actually knew John by name and didn't say, oh, yeah, he was the guy in the sketch. Like, oh, yeah, that's a picture of John. I know him. But they didn't say anything about him being this strange young man who was riding in the skiff that belonged on the investor and disappeared into a crowd while the investor was burning. So one leg of this description that John, or one leg of this investigation that John fits the description is tentable. I mean, that's not even a word. It's thin. We'll go with words I can remember how to pronounce. It is thin. The police claimed the second leg of their motive was that John was angry at Mark for not rehiring him when he purchased this new fishing ship. To support that, the witnesses in town that saw John and Mark and the family and the crew together said that the encounter between John and Mark and the family was not exactly peaceful. Some people in Craig even said that Mark was mad at John for trying to sell his crewmen weed, which John denied when he was arrested. The third leg of this investigation was not any more secure than the first two. John had a prior relationship with the Colthurst family, and it seems that at one time he'd actually been dating Mark's sister. And Mark did not particularly appreciate that because it was a somewhat tumultuous relationship that was kind of on again and off again for like 3 years. So the reason we did this story in a 2-part series is because the trial and the investigation and the outcome I find fascinating. So we're going to talk about the trial. I have the sources list in last week and this week's video down below. And the prosecution was not willing to admit that their case against John was airtight. And John's defense lawyer was out to sink this case. John hired a man named Philip Widener. And Widener went after the prosecution like a dog with a bone. He accused the prosecution of a few less than legal things. He accused them of intimidating their own witnesses. He accused them of altering the official grand jury transcript. He accused the prosecution of failing to turn over interrogation tape and transcript. And he accused them of changing that transcript. So supposedly, according to Philip, that the video of John's interrogation was not released to the defense. Instead, they sent over a typed transcript. And the prosecution claimed in the transcript that John allegedly said that he was scared and could not believe the things he had done. But Philip and John alleged that the real statement was that he couldn't believe the police thought he could do those things. Philip also went after the science. And he went after the science in a couple of really big ways. The accelerant that was used in the fire left a white gas residue. But gasoline, the kind that John was supposedly seen purchasing, would not have left behind white residue. That type of residue is something that is more in common with kerosene or other types of fuel. Meanwhile, while Philip is trying to put a hole in the prosecution's case, John is acting like a weirdo. He is showing up to his court appearances in disguises like fake mustaches, wigs, different shaped glasses, all to alter his appearance. And the police were told not to speak to John at any point in time while they were transporting him from holding to the courtroom. Philip claimed this was all for his client's protection, but who are they protecting? Who is this protecting John from? Mark's family doesn't even believe that John is the murderer. So who does he need to be protected from? Now, as I stated before, the trial was scheduled to begin in January of 1986. Wow. And it was theorized it was going to take about 2 months for the jury to hear all of the evidence. And this had now become the largest mass murder in the state of Alaska. But before they could actually get to the trial, they had to have all of the preliminary hearings. And the preliminary hearings were how Philip was trying to sink this case. Philip claimed that during the grand jury, the prosecution had intimidated and kind of bribed their own witnesses. And they bribed them to speak out against John. And Philip also claimed that one witness's testimony was completely false. Philip, the attorney, he asked the judge to resurface the now sunk investor because he wanted it re-examined. His claim was that the prosecution failed to have the ship towed to shore and that it was deliberately sunk to destroy evidence. The reality is the investor was, it sunk while it was being towed back to Washington State for refitting. If you remember from last week, John's father and another business partner had gone in on this boat together, and the attempt was going to be made to get this boat seaworthy again. So after hearing all of these complaints that Philip had about this case, in August of 85, the presiding judge actually gave it to the prosecution kind of with both barrels. He said that they failed to present that in the grand jury, the prosecution failed to present some evidence that could possibly absolve John from this crime. And that evidence, well, one of their own witnesses was shown a photo of John and said, yeah, I know him. That's not the guy. And they were told not to mention that to the grand jury. When the witness, the prosecution's own witness said yeah, I know, John, he was not the guy I saw. They said, yeah, don't mention that. So after hearing all of this, the judge actually ultimately agreed with the defense and threw out the original indictment against John. He told the prosecution that they could proceed, but that they had to start over at the beginning, and they had to do so without that specific witness. In spite of that rather angry indictment against the prosecution refiled. They went ahead and refiled charges to indict John. Now, John's bond was not reduced from $1 million, but his family and friends had managed to to put together enough money to not only pay his attorney's retainer, but to get that percentage that was required to get him out on bond or on bail. The other thing, though, is that the judge did not agree that the prosecution had been intimidating the witnesses, and he didn't really agree with the thought that the prosecution had deliberately sunk the investor to prevent other physical evidence from being found. So fast forward to the second grand jury is convened, and John, even without that one witness that was prohibited, was again indicted. The charges were the same: murder of 8 people and arson. And the new trial date, was actually set to begin the same time, January of 1986. But this time the judge told the jurors to prepare to be there for 4 months. He said that the time frame was lengthened because a lot of witnesses were going to have to be brought in from out of state. Now, the cost of bringing these witnesses in with planes and boats has now made this not only the most heinous crime in Alaska history to date, but the most expensive trial up to that time. At that point, the defense really began its long game. Philip publicly announced that he would be taking the case pro bono, for free, because he believed that the state's evidence was preposterous. He firmly believed that John was being scapegoated, and he was not having any of it. So that January of 1986, the trial begins, and the witnesses are called, and the evidence is presented, and the prosecution is sticking with this 3-legged investigation, right? They are claiming that John fit the description, that he was angry at Mark for not hiring him back onto the crew, and he was angry at the crew for having taken his place. Some witnesses claimed that John made comments leading them to believe he knew the victims were shot to death before the police ever released that information. And if you remember last week, that was not known until autopsies were done because of the fire. The crew of the Decade was the boat that the investor was anchored to, was questioned about what they saw or heard, because they were literally attached to this ship the night when the murders would have taken place. And because the crew was celebrating the end of their fishing season, their testimony basically was, well, it was loud, and maybe we heard screams, and maybe we heard an explosion, but we were loud, and it was drunk, and we were drunk. So they really were not awesome witnesses for either the prosecution or the defense, because the screams they heard could have been coming from their own ship, and the explosions could have not been explosions. So they really were not great. I'm not sure why they were even called to testify, to be honest. So the prosecution calls all of their own witnesses and puts on their whole trial or their whole case. And then the defense calls their own witnesses. And they had just as many witnesses to dispute the statements of the prosecutor's witnesses. And they called several people from town who knew John and said, no, he was not the guy we saw in the skiff that night. Philip then went as far as to say the murders had been committed by a professional hitman. And remember last week we talked about one of the theories that floated was that Mark had made his fortune to purchase that new fancy vessel by running drugs, not by fishing. And Philip again brought that theory into play. He suggested that as he was questioning his witnesses, that the murderer was actually a drug runner, somebody after Mark. And he tied the idea of a professional hitman and the drug runners together, and claiming that somebody wanted Mark to do something, maybe something illegal, and that the family and crew being held at gunpoint was Mark's pressure point. And then, of course, as a good defense attorney thinks they have to do, I suppose, he called into question the victim himself. Philip argued that Mark was prone to fits of anger and rage when he had been drinking. Keep in mind, the police didn't find any record of this, but this was his claim. And the initial coroner had testified that both Mark and Irene had high blood alcohol levels at the time of their death. And last but not least, Philip again claimed the prosecution was leading on witnesses to testify in exchange for favors. So both sides presented their evidence, and they rested their case in August of 1986. That was way more than 4 months, I'm just saying. The jury of 9 women and 3 men who had not been sequestered through the whole trial were sent to deliberate. The panel of jurors had been impaneled for almost 7 months at that point. And on Thursday, August 28th of 1986, the jury informed the judge that they were completely unable to reach consensus about the guilt or innocence of John Peel. After 25 weeks of testimony, 800 pieces of evidence, 150 witnesses, and several hours of listening to the recorded testimony, it was a hung jury. And while this decision would bring the most expensive trial in Alaska's history to that point to an end, it did not answer the question. Who killed Mark and Irene? Did John do it? The case was handed back to the state to determine if there was reason to retry the case. And in October of 1986, they said yes, they would again go to trial. They would bring John to trial again. In an effort to keep costs associated with the retrial, however, they moved the trial to Juneau, Alaska. Juneau was a bigger city, easier access, that kind of thing. And John was released into house arrest. So this time, instead of needing bail or bond, he was on house arrest. Preliminary hearings began again, or were slated to begin again, in November of 1987, but they didn't actually begin until January of 1988. 1988. And this was a whole nother long battle with a whole new jury, but the same game plan. Same witnesses, same evidence, same motive. The prosecution did add one new witness to the trial, and this was a state trooper who had been working on the case through the years, and he was able to lead the jury through the way that the police created a profile of their suspect. And his testimony said that the suspect would have to have a knowledge of the shipping industry, knowledge of the family's habits, and a motive. And it was a slightly cleaner approach to this idea of John being the guy than they presented in the first trial. The defense, Philip, came back again at Mark. He had all the same knowledge that John was accused of having, and his motive was again drug running. This time, Philip claimed that Mark had been able to buy the boat because of the drug running. He actually presented that as his his theory of how or why this happened. Both sides, the attorneys on both sides, seem to be taking this retrial very personally. More than one time, the judge had to call them to order and told them to behave, like they were getting in trouble for their behavior in the courtroom. And this trial went through April of 1988. It was shorter than the first, and it ended when the defense called no one. So prosecution stands up, they make their claim, they make their case, they sit down, they rest, and prosecution said, yeah, we don't have any witnesses. Philip claimed that the burden was on the state and that the state had not met the burden. The prosecution then admitted in their closing statements that they did not have a confirmed motive or fingerprints or even the murder weapon, but they didn't really need that. They had everything else. And the defense in their closing said the prosecutors just said it. They don't have evidence. They don't have motive. They don't have the murder weapon. And in addition, how could John, who was 22 years old at the time, had power over 5 other adult men? It should have come as no surprise that by the weekend, the jury had reached their decision, and John Peel, who by this time had been held in prison and on house arrest for nearly 4 years, was found not guilty. He was acquitted of all the charges. The state, the prosecution, then proceeded to claim that their case was sound and they were unable to prove it in court. They said, quote, "Our system is built on the theory that it is better to let 9 guilty persons go free than to convict 1 innocent man. In this case, John Peel is going free for 9 crimes. I can say that it is the state's view that we know who the killer is. It's just apparent that the state was not able to convince the jury that there was sufficient evidence of that." They literally blamed the jury. Yeah, they blamed the jury. In 1990, John filed a lawsuit against the state of Alaska for $150 million. But that money was actually payable to his friends and his family that had gone almost bankrupt, arranging his bail, and then taking care of him during house arrest because the judge had determined he could be on house arrest, but he had to be supervised 24 hours a day. John even stated in his lawsuit that one of his conditions was that the case continued to be investigated. It took 7 years for this case, that lawsuit, to reach a settlement, and it was a settlement of like $900,000. So if you're like me, you're probably wondering, well, what the heck? Then who did it? So we're going to talk theories here. Theory number 1, John did it, and the state was so sure of themselves that they halfway themselves out of a conviction. Twice. I find that to be a plausible theory. Theory 2. Now, this was a theory that was speculated by some members of the media. Little John, the 4-year-old boy, his remains weren't found, and the crime scene investigators speculated that that's because his body was at the incineration point of the fire. Some people claim that he was actually a kidnap victim and that the murders and the fire were a cover-up for that crime. I think that is less likely due to the boat being tied to other boats in the ocean thing. Remember how we talked about that the boats were docked up, tied to other boats? It seems like hearing a kid scream, "No, leave me alone, give me back to my mom," would raise flags even with drunk sailors. I don't know, just a thing. Third theory, Mark did have drug ties. That was the theory. That was what Philip continued to say. Except that. It was common knowledge that Mark never carried cash when he was fishing. Remember when he went to dinner, he wrote a check to a friend so he would have money to pay for dinner the night in the restaurant. A drug runner would probably have money, so I'm super iffy on that one. So I'm not in the boat of Mark having gun runner ties. But here's the twist. Remember last week we talked about the gas station owner who said that a young man in the skiff that belonged to the investor purchased 2.5 gallons of gas? Well, his name was Jim. And he even testified, he was a prosecution witness, that John was the guy who bought the gas. In fact, he was the most convincing of the prosecution's witnesses. After the second trial, after the acquittal of John, it came to light that Jim wasn't really Jim. He's actually a man named Kenneth Robertson, convicted arsonist with a history of violent crime, especially against women. In fact, he was wanted in Arizona for escaping from a halfway house. He still owed Arizona 4 years for the arson of an unoccupied structure. And some of the violence he committed against the women in his life was carried out via threats that he would hurt them with the use of firearms or explosives. After the 2 trials, he went on to own and operate a shipping business. He chartered 12 vehicles to Exxon when they had to clean up their oil spill in 1991. And one of those ships faced tragedy of its own when it dropped off 2 crewmen on an island and they were never found alive. And that story is what is how we found out that Jim wasn't Jim, but he was Kenneth. Oh, now did Kenneth do it? Well, I'm not going to say he did because that would be slanderous or libel or whatever it is when you talk about people. I'm just saying that it seems a little suspicious to have a man with an arsonist background show up in the middle of an investigation as a witness. If I were investigating this case, that is one avenue I think I would definitely follow. This is still technically an unsolved case, although I think in the records I heard it called an unresolved, like you can see my air quotes here, unresolved case. I did find a picture of John in court with the ski mask on his head. And then I found another picture of John about the time of his arrest. Weird story. I appreciate you hanging out with me. I know it's a little bit of a disruption when the story has to stop in the middle and continue again, but I really do appreciate you hanging out with me. I've added a couple of other videos here, as well as a subscribe button. If you haven't yet subscribed to my channel, I would love it if you did. Leave me a comment below. Tell me which theory you think fits, and have a really fabulous day.